engagement. That region is emerging as a hub of economic development with huge natural resources. And to help us understand all of this, we're joined by Kathryn Rooney Vera in Miami. She's a global strategist at Bulltick Capital. Kathryn, the World Cup had the world's attention on Brazil for the past several weeks. Can you talk about Latin America's growing international role?
Well, certainly it's taking on its own voice, Elaine, and I think it's evident in the BRICS summit. I mean, certainly that it's following the World Cup right there in Brazil, and Brazil is part of the BRICS. One of the main countries this year won't grow too much, but has historically grown at high rates of growth. I think what's most important here and what will be discussed is precisely as discussed in the introduction, the reserves fund, which will be important to counterbalance any balance of payments crises, and the other fund. I mean, the fact that this can become a development bank targeted to infrastructure projects and provide an alternative to the U.S., the IMF, and the World Bank.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit more about that. They've been talking about this proposed new development bank and reserve fund. What will this mean for these emerging economies? You talked about infrastructure. How realistic is this? What are the long-term prospects? When can we see something in play?
Oh, great questions. I mean, this is precisely targeted to infrastructure investment, as you mentioned, and also to avoid the requirements that come along with an IMF, for example, a bailout or line of credit, or with the World Bank even. So no policy requirements would be attached to, in theory, a loan from this infrastructure development fund. The real question is, how realistic is this? I think if it were to come online and become relevant, that would take 10 to 20 years. Certainly not now. Just to give you some numbers, the World Bank and IMF together pooled resources amount to about $700 billion. That's available resources for use right now. We're talking about 50 to 100 billion between the bank and the reserve fund. And a portion of that only would be allotable to extend credit per year. The World Bank, for example, this year is targeted to lend $60 billion in lines. So really, this is a very diverse group. I mean, I credit them for the fact that they were able to put money on the table and come up with something concrete. So we do have something at this point. But the relevance of it and the realistic expectation that this could take the place of the IMF or the World Bank, I think is yet to be determined, and again, would come in 10 to 20 years' time.
What about BRICS engagement in this region? What will that do to further Latin America's role in the global economy?
Well, absolutely very important. I mean, what we've been seeing lately, for example, is Russian and Chinese investment in Latin America, specifically in the countries that are kind of left-leaning, which is what we're seeing within the BRICS and beyond. I mean, Russian President Vladimir Putin recently visited Cuba, Nicaragua, obviously Brazil, Argentina. Russia is investing in nuclear energy in those countries, in many of those countries. China is investing in a canal in Nicaragua. So certainly important and growing in importance. And I think Latin America is also seeking some of these countries. We have two different camps, so, the more left-leaning and the more market-driven countries in Latin America. But these particular countries are certainly moving toward that sphere of influence of the Russias, of the Chinas of the world.
What do you see are the big expectations for this year's summit there in Brazil? And what do you think the big takeaway will be once this is all over?
I mean, this is another BRICS summit. I think the most obvious takeaway is the bank and the reserve fund. Money's going on the table. But really, let's face it, the BRICS, in and of themselves, have domestic issues that they have to grapple with. So once they go home, will they be focused on the reserve fund? At this point, look, Russia is facing 0.5% growth, maybe negative growth. Brazil's at 1% growth. India has a new president. There's got to be some new structural reforms therein. China's facing a deceleration. So each of these countries has its own set of domestic variables to really contend with. So I think that this is going to be a summit that these issues are discussed and put forward, again, with a more long-term time horizon.
All right, Kathryn Rooney Vera, thank you so much for your perspective and insight from Miami.